You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Wednesday, the 30th of January. Broadside fired at BBC over its militant mess. 37 jail killers walk out and flee. It's too cold for you over here, Eastern Europeans are told. Mussolini did well, apart from race laws, says Berlusconi. Corruption levels mortifying, court president says. Armenians persecuted in Turkey. Death sentences for an anti-Islam film upheld. Thought for the day, a Europe divided yet again. And finally, a hole in one. UK news. Broadside fired at BBC over its militant mess. Famously, after the 7/7 bomb attacks on London commuters in 2005, the BBC's head of news, Helen Boaden, sent a memo to staff saying that the word terrorist can be a barrier rather than an aid to understanding. True to form, the corporation's reports of the recent bloodbath in Algeria, in which at least 48 innocent lives were lost, have described the killers as militants rather than terrorists. In one report the word was used 12 times. Not surprisingly, this has outraged many MPs. One, Andrew Bridgen, has written an angry letter to the beleaguered Ms Boaden, who has just resumed overall command of BBC News despite being criticised twice in a review over her mishandling of the Jimmy Savile scandal. The Tory MP for North West Leicestershire also raised the issue with David Cameron in the Commons last week. In reply, the PM said, "They are terrorists and should be described as such." Bridgen, in his letter to Ms Boaden, wrote, "I am horrified the BBC has consistently described the perpetrators of these heinous crimes as militants rather than the terrorists they are." 37 jail killers walk out and flee. Alarm over security at open prisons as figures reveal 175 inmates absconded last year. Dozens of dangerous criminals, including murderers, rapists and paedophiles, are simply walking out of prison. Last year 175 inmates left open prisons or disappeared while on day release, the equivalent of one every other day. The list of violent offenders who have absconded over the last 3 years includes 37 murderers and 5 rapists. Among them is rapist Ivan Leach, a predatory paedophile and ruthless robber whose criminal record stretches back 3 decades. The tattooed thug is suspected of breaking into a woman's home and raping her whilst he was on the run. Others include a man who stabbed a teacher to death while high on lighter fuel and a teenager who killed a Good Samaritan who tried to stop a robbery. Last night the MP who uncovered the figures asked how criminals guilty of such serious offences could be allowed to roam free. Romanians and Bulgarians to be told the UK's too cold for you in advertising campaign to try and deter them from coming to Britain. Plans have been drawn up for an advertising campaign denouncing Britain as cold and wet to deter Romanians and Bulgarians from coming to the UK. Ministers are working on ideas to prevent an influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe when restrictions are lifted on citizens from the 2 countries moving to the EU next New Year's Day. A public information campaign would warn those considering a move that they won't be able to cash in on state largesse and that the weather is bad. Under proposals being examined in Downing Street, the Home Office and the Department for Work and Pensions, the new migrants, who are expected to number at least 70,000 over the next 5 years, would face tough restrictions on the benefits they could claim. One option would see new arrivals deported after 3 months if they don't have a job. Another plan would require those arriving from Romania and Bulgaria to show that they have the means to support themselves for 6 months. 40 primary school pupils expelled for violence every day. 40 primary school pupils are expelled every day for attacking their teachers as levels of violence amongst under 11s reaches a record high, official figures disclose. The latest data from the Department for Education reveals that exclusions for assaulting teachers are now more common among primary school children than in secondary schools. The statistics showed that 8,030 primary school pupils aged 5 to 11 were expelled in the 2010-2011 teaching year, a rise of 15% over 4 years. Unions have warned that this figure may not even represent the truth of the endemic violence, as staff are warned not to report incidents to protect the reputation of their schools. The South East has seen the sharpest rise in violence in this age group, increasing by 41% from 2006-2007 to 2010-2011. Philip Davis, MP for Shipley, told the Daily Mail that the extraordinary figures were a sad indictment on the state of our society, the lack of discipline, the lack of respect for authority, and some pretty bad parenting. A World Date writer comments, "Of course the authorities are blaming everyone but the most obvious cause, the very high rise in ethnic immigrant children who come from very different cultures and whom the teachers are forbidden to reprimand." European news. Italy. Mussolini did well apart from race laws, says Berlusconi. Mussolini did well but the racial laws were wrong, said former Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi. The racial laws were the worst mistake of the leader Mussolini, who in many other respects, however, did well, he told reporters on his arrival at the Shoah Memorial in Milan. Italian corruption levels mortifying, court president says. Country 72nd out of 100 nations and on a par with Bosnia. Italy's corruption levels, estimated to be on a par with Bosnia, are an embarrassment, according to comments made on Friday in an official speech by Ernesto Lupo, chief president of the Court of Cassation. Lupo, who was presenting an official report on the state of the Italian justice system, was referring to a recent Transparency International report on international corruption levels released in December. He called the status awarded to Italy mortifying, adding that many non-European nations, even third world ones, had overtaken the Eurozone's third largest economy in terms of lower corruption levels. Italy slid 3 notches to 72nd place in Transparency International's 2012 Corruption Perception Index, released in December. On a 100-point scale, the country scored 42, well behind countries such as Namibia and Rwanda, according to the Berlin-based NGO, which measured perceived levels of public sector corruption in 176 countries and territories around the world. Greece, which fell to 94th place, and Italy, were seen as having suffered from increased corruption amid the global economic crisis. World news. An 87-year-old Christian woman was repeatedly stabbed and a cross carved onto her corpse. The implications of the cross being carved onto Marissa Kuchuk's corpse are not explored, no surprise there, in this Economist story. The Economist has never shown any willingness to discuss the jihad against non-Muslims. Marissa Kuchuk was a little old Armenian lady who lived on her own in Samatya, a picturesque neighbourhood of Istanbul where Christians and Muslims used to rub along peacefully. On December the 28th, Miss Kuchuk was found dead in her apartment. She had been stabbed repeatedly. Relatives said a crucifix was carved onto her naked corpse. Last week a masked assailant attacked another elderly Armenian as she was entering her apartment. He punched her in the head. When she fell to the ground, he began kicking her. "My mother's mouth was filled with blood. The neighbours came to the rescue when she screamed for help and the man fled," Mariam Yelegin told Agos, a Turkish Armenian weekly. The attack marks the 5th in the past 2 months against elderly Armenian women, and one has lost an eye. All of the attacks took place in Samatya, which is home to some 8,000 Armenians and the seat of the Armenian Orthodox Patriarchate. Opinion remains divided as to whether these organised hate crimes targeting non-Muslims or just random theft. Istanbul's governor, Hüseyin Avni Mutlu, insists that it was the latter. The incident was inspired by robbery. There were no racial motives. "Be sure we will find the perpetrators. Good night," he tweeted some 100,000 followers. A World Date reporter comments, and that is exactly where these cases will stay, on Twitter. Egypt. Death penalties for makers of anti-Islam film upheld. From Ansamed, January the 29th, thanks to Insubria. Cairo. After the green light given by the Grand Mufti of Egypt, Cairo's Supreme Court on Tuesday upheld the death sentences of 7 Egyptian citizens involved in the film Innocence of Muslims, whose trailer caused deadly unrest throughout the Arab world in September. A co-defendant, US pastor Terry Jones, was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The 7, all Coptic Christians who reside in the US, were found guilty of insulting Islam and threatening national unity. Among them is Nicholas Basili, who directed the film that sparked the fatal protests. In Cairo, protesters scaled the walls of the US Embassy and ripped the stars and stripes off the flagpole at the centre of the compound. Hacked emails reveal Washington-approved plan to stage chemical weapons attack in Syria. Obama administration complicit in war crime. Alleged hacked emails from defence contractor in Britain reveal a plan approved by Washington and funded by Qatar to stage a chemical weapons attack in Syria and blame it on the Assad regime, fulfilling what the Obama administration has made clear is a red line that would mandate US military intervention. The fact that the plan involves delivering a CW chemical weapon that is similar to those Assad should have clearly suggests that the idea is to stage a false flag chemical weapons attack that could be blamed on Assad by Gulf states like Qatar and the NATO powers. If the claim that such a plot was approved by Washington can be verified, then the Obama administration is complicit in a war crime. President Mohamed Morsi responded to days of rioting across Egypt by declaring a state of emergency in the 3 worst hit cities. Mr Morsi spoke on Egyptian state television to impose curfews and military control reminiscent of the Mubarak era on Port Said, Suez and Ismailia. Earlier, 6 people died in fighting in Port Said between mourners, protesters and the police at funerals for some of the 31 people killed in clashes on Saturday, when protests against death sentences handed down to football rioters were met with live fire and tear gas. In a worrying development, protesters were armed and fired shots at police lines. Mr Morsi has been criticised for his low profile during a series of disturbances that began in Cairo on Thursday night, the eve of the 2nd anniversary of the Tahrir Square protests that brought down ex-President Hosni Mubarak. He ordered a 30-day state of emergency with curfews in the 3 Suez Canal cities. Suez saw 9 deaths on Friday after protests marked the revolution, while the governorate and the Muslim Brotherhood headquarters in Ismailia were both stormed. At least 232 people die in Brazilian nightclub fire, as survivors say security guards tried to stop people leaving burning building. Security guards tried to stop revellers escaping from a Brazil nightclub as a fire ravaged through the building, killing at least 232 people. An eyewitness to the incident, which happened in the early hours of this morning, said door staff initially did not understand what was happening and tried to stop people leaving through the exit door. In what appears to be the deadliest nightclub fire for a decade, people were reportedly screaming "there's a fire" but were trapped inside the burning building. But other eyewitnesses said that once the security guards realised how serious the fire was, they tried to help people escape. Thought for the day: a Europe divided again? Is Europe becoming a divided continent again? I can see the very early divisions blooming in Germany, particularly of a nation adopting another culture and religion, much like they adopted the culture of the ancient Germanic tribes and the Aryan way during the rise of the Third Reich. If you look at the history of Germany and some of the outlying smaller countries around primarily Austria, their histories are very different, but they follow the same path. I've been to Germany, and the country around the Rhine and the southern part near Bavaria is superb, and the people are, or were for the most part, the ideal Germanic peoples, with the ideas of home, hearth and children well established. Now, whether you like it or not, if one were in that what-if situation and the Germans had won the war, which they would have done had they not invaded Russia, and the Americans had not turned a blind eye to the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese in order to allow the US into the war, courtesy of President Roosevelt, what sort of a world would we be living in? Clearly not the sort of England we are living in now. Now, I'm trying to ignore the Jewish problem here, but it is hard to ignore when it is rooted so deeply in modern history, the final solution and the reasoning therein. The culture of the Third Reich against the Jewish people was racial and financial. The first was unavoidable, because the Germans tied up race with religion. If you were of the Jewish persuasion, you were of the Jewish or Hebrew race, and you were persecuted. It has to be said that the economy of Germany was rock bottom after the Treaty of Versailles, and people were starving, including ex-soldiers who had fought in World War I. Amongst those was a Corporal Hitler. You had massive communist protests on the streets, and things were going from bad to worse. It is well known that in these circumstances people need someone to hate as well as love, and the Jews were the only people in Germany of a different racial aspect, culture and religion. The Jewish people had settled in Germany for over 800 years. They spoke a form of Yiddish based on the German language, and they thought of themselves as German Jews, and many had fought in the war for Germany. It is also well documented that during those awful times after the war, they did take over most of the large financial houses and became landlords of properties acquired on the Germans' poverty. This and other reasons, whether real or perceived, gave rise to the Third Reich's attitude to the Jewish or the Hebrew people. Now, what I find odd nowadays with modern unified Germany is the way in which the Germans seem to be adopting the ways of Islam and its people when they rejected the Jews who had been there many, many years. These Muslims have been there, 60 years or thereabouts? In one way it is no surprise. Even during the last war the Germans befriended the Arabs and have always backed the Muslim hatred of Israel when it was formed. It was seen that anything goes with a German as long as it isn't a Jew. However, they could be hoist with their own petard, as Muslims are a truly fanatical and devious peoples on the whole. Jews do not want to convert anyone who isn't born a Jew. To be a true Jew you have to have a Jewish mother. The bloodline passes through the matriarchal stem. It doesn't matter if your father was a rabbi. If your mother was not of the Jewish faith, you aren't, even though you might have Hebrew blood. Jews usually do not become suicide bombers. Jews have done and do live alongside Christians quite amicably in the UK and Europe and the rest of the world for many centuries. Jews do not build huge synagogues on every street in every city of every country they have immigrated to. Orthodox Jews have a culture much like the Muslims. Women shave their heads and wear wigs as opposed to the full veil. Their kitchen is frum, which means the kashrut laws prevail. They never marry out and their children are raised to the ideals of the Talmud. Their sense of family is important, as indeed it is in Islam. Also, the one link both religions have that we in the Christian religion do not is that they are still waiting for their Messiah, and we already know he's been and gone. But seriously, money is also a very important part of what once was a desert peoples in both Judaism and Islam. Never come between a Jew or a Muslim and his money. So with all this in common, why the hatred from both and the love of one country for just one of those cultures? Germany will never be pro-Jew. Too much has been told of the hatred the Germans held for the Jew, but there are many stories of Jews being helped by Germans during the war, and one must remember they did exist in Germany for hundreds of years without the pogroms suffered in Russia, both under the Tsar and Stalin. What is more worrying is the current budding relationship between Islam and Germany. Are we to be faced with an Islamo-fascist army in the future? There's a news item I'm going to read to you which highlights the problem. Germany, pro-Muslim, anti-fascist, leftist get the crap beat out of them by Muslims. What we didn't know about the Muslim protests against the right-wing pro-NRW party anti-Islam cartoon contest the other day. On May the 1st in Solingen, the German anti-Islam movement, pro-North Rhine-Westphalia, held a demonstration. Hundreds of assorted Muslims and far-left extremists turned up to harass and intimidate them. Two of these anti-fascists found themselves in the midst of a horde of Salafist Muslims who promptly started beating them up with bits of wood. Even after they were lying helpless and passive on the ground, the Muslims kept laying into them. One was badly hurt in the head, the other in the arm. Both required hospital treatment. Apparently it wasn't a failure of recognition either. The Muslims knew that these were leftist anti-fascists who had come to protest against the Islamophobes. They beat them up anyway. On India media, the Antifa activists are whining about what happened, wondering whether they should organise a protest against the Salafists, but say they're worried they may not get permission. Permission? Who is running these people? So here is the conundrum. If the German left-wingers, who, like our own leftist morons, are anti-fascist and pro-Muslim, get the what's-it beaten out of them at a demo, it looks like we should be celebrating in the British National Party. But we really should not. And why? Because if the German Muslims are powerful enough to beat up demonstrators protesting on their behalf, what would they do if the German right-wingers protested against the Muslims and their colonisation of Germany? It was seen that these Muslims are taking on the uniforms of the Waffen-SS and taking on the communist element as in the 1930s. It was seen the Islamic creed of hatred towards Jews has encroached to a very large extent on the German psyche, and owing to the propaganda since the end of the last war against the Third Reich and its proclivities, they're doing a U-turn. They're going to be seen to raise the Islamic elements in their country to do battle with the left and probably the right-wing elements, and either decimate the Islamic population in a race war when they have served their purpose, or alternatively install a controllable caliphate in Europe. Perhaps their mantra is, if you cannot beat them, join them. In essence, this would be a disaster for the UK and France. Neither country wants a huge Islamic population because the numbers would not remain stable, and this is not counting the massive cost to the indigenous populations of both England and France. We could safely kiss goodbye to our country in around 20 years if the Islamic control of Germany is not curtailed in some way. Germany has a massive standing army well hidden by Merkel, and the economic situation is going to be just about the right temperature that existed before the Second World War. But who will the German people, if any, remain in actual power, choose to make their scapegoat? On the other side of the coin, it's being said that most of the German people, not their government, hate Islam too. I will read from a report I received from our European correspondent in France. A recent post here, only 74%, elaborated on what we already know. France, Britain and the rest of the Western world is fed up with the creeping Islamisation of their countries, orchestrated by left-wing politicians who have forced its citizens to endure millions of barely civilised immigrants from the Muslim world who refuse to assimilate and integrate, but prefer for the most part to live off the state. Giving a shocking image of anti-Islam sentiments in Germany, a new study has revealed that Islamophobia, anti-Islamism, has become culturally acceptable in the country, and that society is shifting its attention from xenophobia to religious bias against Muslims, the local newspaper reported. It's no longer the Turks, but the Muslims, Wilhelm Heitmeyer, head of the Institute for Research on the Interdisciplinary Conflict and Violence at Bielefeld University, told the New Osnabrücker Zeitung, the local reported. A research by the Bielefeld University found that Islamophobia, anti-Islamism, has become culturally acceptable in Germany. Heitmeyer said that the general hostility against foreigners had given way to a growing rejection of Islam in that country. This bigotry, moving from the confines of ethnicity towards religious bias against Muslims, does not exist only in the far right, he said. Heitmeyer noted that anti-Muslim sentiments were also present in more left-leaning and centrist circles, appearing throughout the country from the highest echelons of society to the lowest. The findings are not new. An earlier study from Münster University in 2010 found that 66% of Western Germans and 74% of Eastern Germans had a negative attitude towards Muslims. A more recent study from the Allensbach Institute suggested that this has not changed over the past 2 years. Asking German people about Islam, only 22% said they agreed with Germany's former president Christian Wulff's statement that Islam, like Christianity, was part of Germany. Germany has between 3.8 and 4.3 million Muslims, making up some 5% of the total 82 million population, according to government commissioned studies. Experts noticed that the rising anti-Muslim bias was generally acceptable in German society as freedom of opinion. Criticism of Islam or Muslims appear acceptable because it is not seen as classically racist, Alexander Hausler, neo-Nazi expert from Dusseldorf's Technical University, said. Or as the World Date reporter comments, maybe because Islam is not a race but a religion like Judaism. German Muslims have also voiced concern about a growing hostility in their country. Germany has been recently gripped by a fierce debate on immigration and integration. In 2009, central banker Thilo Sarrazin sparked a debate on the integration after accusing Muslim immigrants of undermining the society, which is becoming less intelligent because of them. Chancellor Merkel weighed in, saying that multiculturalism had failed in Germany. With the growing number of Muslims, distrust of Islam is rising. The cashier at the supermarket wears a headscarf, copies of the Koran are handed out on the streets, and mosques have become part of some cities' landscapes. Islam also appears to be encroaching on life in Germany, and that bothers a lot of people. An example of right-wing parties are pro-NRW and pro-Deutschland, which have campaigned against the construction of the mosque in Cologne and elsewhere with aggressive posters and borderline language. The message between the lines is clear: Islam is dangerous and there is no place for Muslims in Germany. So we have the grassroots side of the argument. Will we have a Germany split down the middle or a unified Islamic fascist state? Now, how we in the UK approach this growing problem will be indicative of the way Europe and we handle it, and history does have a way of repeating itself on the great wheel of life. And finally, a hole-in-one. It's been reported in the Telegraph that a group of buildings were totally swallowed up by a hole which appeared near the construction site of the new underground train station in Guangzhou, one of China's biggest cities. The first building collapsed at 16:20 local time. The other 3 buildings then fell into the 10-metre hole later that evening, according to China State Television. Around 300 residents from the surrounding area had to be evacuated and nearby roads were closed off. No one was injured in the incident and an investigation was launched into what caused the hole to appear. Giant sinkholes have been appearing across China in recent weeks, sparking fears of an imminent earthquake amongst residents. Well, that particular province is responsible for a lot of the crap we pay to have brought into this country, so as far as this presenter is concerned, the more sinkholes the better, plus a large dose of earthquakes. It would help reduce our debt to China no end. You have been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynn Mozart and I wish you all a very good night.